This collapse did not arrive with a single explosion. It arrived quietly, through numbers. In 2018, $1 bought 70,000 Rials. Today it takes nearly 1.5 million. That is not decline, that is free fall. When money collapses this fast, prices stop guiding behavior. They start punishing it. Hyperinflation above 40% does more than empty wallets. It destroys memory. Savings vanish. Wages lose meaning. Tomorrow becomes unknowable. Rice turns into a speculative asset. Imported goods disappear from ordinary life. The middle class erodes without headlines. This is not simply an economic crisis. It is a signal. Because when a state can no longer price reality, it cannot govern reality either. If you want to understand how systems truly fail, stay with me. Follow this analysis, because this collapse is not isolated and it is not finished. Before we talk about blame, we need to understand the structure breaking beneath it all. To understand what is breaking, we have to be precise. This is not a temporary shock, not a bad year, not a policy mistake that can be reversed quietly. It is a multi-layer failure. The currency is collapsing, so prices no longer reflect value. The labor market is contracting, so work no longer guarantees survival. Institutions are hollowing out, so rules no longer protect effort. When these failures overlap, an economy stops functioning as an economy. It becomes a coping mechanism. People shorten their time horizons. They stop saving. They stop investing. They stop believing the system will reward patience. What replaces trust is improvisation. What replaces legality is necessity. This is the moment where official narratives lose power, where parallel systems emerge, where survival logic overrides civic logic, and this shift matters more than any headline number, because once a society crosses this threshold, recovery is no longer technical. It becomes political, psychological, and deeply unstable. To see how Iran reached this point, we have to look backward. Not to a single decision, but to a pattern, one built slowly and ignored for too long. The roots of this collapse are older than the crisis itself. For years, the economy was built on a single assumption that oil would compensate for everything else. When revenue flowed, inefficiency was tolerated, subsidies expanded, the state grew wider, not smarter. Structural reform was postponed again and again. This model worked as long as external conditions cooperated, but dependence creates exposure. When access to markets narrowed, when sanctions tightened, when prices fluctuated, the system had no shock absorbers. To fill the gap, deficits widened, and the response was not productivity but liquidity. Money was printed to cover shortfalls, not once, repeatedly. The result was predictable. More currency, the same goods, prices detached from wages. At the same time, demographics shifted. A young educated population entered adulthood just as the private sector began shrinking. Opportunity collapsed from both ends. This is how long-term erosion works. Quiet, administrative, invisible to outsiders until pressure reaches a threshold. And when it does, the first real rupture is not political, it is economic. And that rupture has consequences. The break became visible when prices stopped behaving normally. They didn't rise by the year or the month. They rose by the day. Basic food was no longer affordable. It was unpredictable. Rice jumped from 100,000 Rials to nearly 2 million. Not because supply collapsed, but because money did. Wages stayed still. Inflation did not. Most workers earned between 40 and 60 million Rials a month. On paper, that looked survivable. In reality, it meant choosing between rent and food, medicine and dignity. This was the first mass shock. The moment millions realized that effort no longer translated into stability. If this kind of analysis helps you see what others miss, stay with me. Follow this channel. Because this was not chaos, it was cause and effect. And once the official economy failed to provide answers, people began looking elsewhere. Not for reform, not for relief, but for parallel systems. That search reshaped everything that followed. When the formal economy stopped working, it didn't collapse into chaos. It reorganized underground. Legal trade shrank. Informal trade exploded. Smuggling was no longer criminal. It became structural. Subsidized fuel, crossed borders for profit. Medicine followed the same routes. Even baby formula became contraband. This shadow economy wasn't marginal. It was worth tens of billions each year, large enough to replace formal income for millions. And it was not run by the desperate alone. Networks tied to power controlled access and protection. Insiders bought at state prices and sold at market reality. Official exchange rates lost meaning. True value was set elsewhere in back rooms, cash markets, and whispered numbers. For ordinary citizens, there was no escape. Too poor to exploit the system. Too visible to evade it. This is the hidden engine of collapse. A system where dysfunction rewards loyalty and punishes independence. But underground systems are fragile. They rely on distortions. And the next distortion did not come from money, it came from electricity. To survive isolation, the system turned to energy. Not innovation, not reform, electricity, cheap, subsidized, and dangerously misused. Cryptocurrency mining was legalized, not to modernize the economy, but to bypass it. Energy was converted into digital money. Silently, at scale. By 2025, crypto transactions crossed $1 billion. Mining operations multiplied overnight, warehouses glowed while cities dimmed, but power grids don't bend to politics, they obey physics. Mining began consuming nearly 8% of national electricity. Blackouts spread, factories stalled, homes went dark, entire cities lost power for days, not because of war, but because servers never slept. Once again, access was unequal, state-linked actors mined freely, ordinary citizens absorbed the outages. This was the second rupture, a system feeding on its own infrastructure to delay collapse. Short-term survival, long-term damage. And when lights go out, anger rises, not quietly, not patiently, which is when economic failure stops being abstract and becomes social pressure. Pressure that always seeks an outlet. At some point, this stops being about policy. It becomes about you, about standing in line, doing math in your head, knowing the numbers won't work no matter how carefully you calculate. If you are young, education no longer protects you. 1 in 3 cannot find work. If you are a woman, nearly half are excluded before the race even begins. Your salary arrives, but its value is already gone. 40 million Rials, 60 million, big numbers, small lives. You don't plan anymore. You improvise, you delay medical care, you move back in with family, you watch savings dissolve into time, and the most dangerous loss is not material, it is faith. Faith that effort matters, that rules apply, that tomorrow is negotiable. If you think this can't happen where you live, pause. Millions already believe the same thing. If you want to understand how economic pressure turns into something far more volatile, stay with me. Share this analysis, because when personal despair reaches scale, it never stays personal. It becomes political. It becomes explosive. And that is where the consequences accelerate, far beyond borders. When internal systems fail, their consequences do not stay internal. They spill outward. Oil production continues near 3.2 million barrels per day, but choice disappears. Exports funnel almost entirely to a single buyer, at a discount, through shadow routes. Revenue shrinks even when volume holds. Leverage vanishes. Dependency hardens. When global prices fall below budget thresholds, the damage compounds. Infrastructure funding dries up. Domestic investment is postponed again. Resources flow elsewhere. into deterrence, into regional influence, into survival abroad, not stability at home. This is how domestic collapse becomes a geopolitical risk. Smuggling networks stretch across borders. Energy instability affects neighbors. Migration pressure rises quietly. Markets react faster than governments. Insurance costs climb. Shipping routes adjust. Risk is repriced. A weakened state does not negotiate calmly. It postures from insecurity. It escalates to compensate for fragility. What began as inflation has now become a regional variable, and once instability enters this phase, the future narrows, because systems under this much strain do not drift gently forward. They fracture or they transform, which brings us to the only question that matters. What happens next? From this point forward, there are only three possible paths. The first is managed survival. Inflation remains high but stabilizes. The system adapts just enough to keep functioning. Negotiations ease pressure without changing structure. Life becomes smaller, poorer, but predictable. This is not recovery. It is endurance. The second path is prolonged decay. Banks weaken one by one. Capital continues to leave. Public services erode quietly. The state remains intact, but society fragments underneath it. Corruption hardens. Inequality becomes permanent. Hope exits without drama. This is the most common outcome for systems afraid of reform. The third path is collapse. Rapid, chaotic, uncontrolled. Institutions fail faster than force can contain. Economic logic disappears. Security fractures from within. History is clear on one point. Under stress, systems choose power over stability. And when elites begin moving their money abroad, it signals something unmistakable. They are not planning reform, they are planning escape, which leaves one final question, not about sanctions, not about diplomacy, but about time. How long can a system survive after its own insiders stop believing in it? That question brings us to the end. This is not a sudden collapse, and it is not an accident. It is the outcome of choices, deferred, shielded from consequence. Hyperinflation did not destroy the system alone. Neither did sanctions nor unrest. What broke it was rigidity, the refusal to adapt while calling endurance strength. Every system reaches a moment when control gives way to momentum. Iran is already past that moment. What remains is uncertainty. For its people, for its neighbors, for a region already stretched thin. And this is why this story matters to you, because economic collapse does not stay contained. It migrates, it radicalizes, it destabilizes places that believe distance equals safety. If you want to understand how systems fail before failure becomes visible, follow this channel. Share this analysis, because the next collapse will not announce itself politely. And in the next video, we will examine what happens when pressure turns into rupture and whether collapse always ends in chaos or sometimes in transformation.